Hello and welcome to the Pro Football Focus DFS Chalk Talk podcast. I'm your host, Scott Barrett, joined by the great Tyler Buecher. Tyler, I did some research into the demographic of our listeners, and it turns out that they are all just super hardcore DFS fans who want to make money and they don't care about our personal lives. So maybe some other podcasts you listen to do that, but not us. Tyler, I hope you don't mind me not asking how you're doing. Instead, let's just dive into the good stuff. You okay with that?
Week 9, let's do it.
Today we are going to start off by analyzing the fallout from the Kelvin Benjamin trade and what this means for DFS. Then we're going to talk about what Brock Osweiler starting means for the Broncos receivers. Then we'll discuss strategies revolving the Houston offense and the potentially unfadeable Deshaun Watson. And then finally, we'll talk about some of our favorite plays at each position and look out for some of Tyler's calls when we get to wide receivers. There's some good ones in there. All right, let's try and stick to the main slate as well. I think there's one guy I like not on the main slate, but we'll try and stick to the main slate. Starting off, let's talk about Kelvin Benjamin. So you are not playing him on Thursday night. He was just traded. It's a Thursday night game. The matchup's great, given Claiborne's likely out, Buster Scream's out, Charles Clay's out, but there's no way he plays a full complement of snaps. So while it might boost Tyrod Taylor's fantasy value ever so slightly, he is not someone you're playing this week. Instead, we're going to look to Kelvin Benjamin, Christian McCaffrey, and potentially a very cheap Curtis Samuel. Let me start off with Funchess. So in Week 3, when Benjamin played only 7 snaps due to injury, Christian McCaffrey saw 11 targets, while Devin Funchess saw a season-high 10. Benjamin leaves behind a 19.9% target market share and a 20.9% receiving expected fantasy point market share. Obviously, this trade is massive for Funchess' fantasy value, especially in the immediate with tight end Greg Olsen still out. You know, they're not updating salaries based on this trade. Salaries became for that, and they do not change. But the volume he's seeing is incredible. Even when Benjamin was in the lineup, since Week 3, Funchess ranks 13th among wide receivers in expected fantasy points per game, 14.2, and it's been very steady, seen between 12.0 and 18.6 expected fantasy points per game in each of those games that he played. So definitely a strong value in tournaments as well as cash games. Do you have anything to add there before I lose my mind on the next play?
Nothing much, just that he's seeing significant volume. He's averaging, over his last 6 or so games, he's seen 6, 8, 9, 10 targets. It's not bad at all, considering we could see, I think a reasonable projection is adding at least 2 to 3 targets going his way with Kelvin out of the picture. I don't think that's out of control. He's also seen just 6 targets in the red zone, 0 targets from inside the 10. I think we could see an uptick there with Kelvin out of the picture now. Those are some high scoring opportunities that Kelvin leaves behind. He himself saw 6 targets within the red zone. So I think we could see Funchess back in for some more higher scoring potential here moving forward.
Tyler, when was the NFL draft? Was that April?
April, yeah.
All right, so 6 or 7 months. I've been waiting for this exact moment. It is must-start Christian McCaffrey week. I have waited 6 or 7 months for this moment, and now we get Kelvin Benjamin exiting, which could mean even more targets for McCaffrey, who already absurdly ranks 8th among all players in target market share and 14th in expected fantasy points per game among all players. McCaffrey draws a dream matchup against the Atlanta Falcons, who over the past 2 regular seasons, not including James White's near Super Bowl MVP winning performance against them, they're allowing the most receiving fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. that's all Christian McCaffrey does. He's not going to do much running, but he is blowing the doors off the league as the league's best receiving fantasy running back. Atlanta is also allowing the third most fantasy points per game to receivers on short passes. That's McCaffrey's portion of the field. The fourth most fantasy points per game to opposing slot wide receivers. McCaffrey runs 20% of his routes lined up from the slot as a slot wide receiver. Though note, Funchess also leads the team in slot targets with 12, so he will benefit from that matchup as well. I don't know. He's my RB8 in half-point PPR leagues. He's the 21st highest priced running back on FanDuel. I'm so excited. I know I've talked him up every week, but this week is finally the week where he loses his mind and explodes.
Yeah, you nailed it with the Falcons giving up a ton of points to receiving running backs. He's already got 49 receptions in his first 8 games. That's with him yet to play the Atlanta Falcons, who allow a ton of receptions to the running back position. He's got 2 of those games on the back end of this 2017 season, and I think both those games we need to fire up McCaffrey. He's a lock and load cash game play for me.
Curtis Samuel is also interesting, with the GM coming out saying he believes he's going to start opposite Devin Funchess. He's 3,100 on DraftKings. He's cheap. We'll get some targets. Samuel operates from an area of the field where Atlanta is weaker, much like McCaffrey. Not super on it, but it is worth mentioning. Let's move on to a topic that's pretty gross and kind of sad, at least for me, because I was prepared to go all in on Emmanuel Sanders, who is amazing, who is the wide receiver 1 on this team, at least over the past 2 seasons. And I just imagined, Simeon is back to the fire, job in jeopardy. He's just going to go all out, target Sanders on every route he runs. But ultimately, that's not the case. Osweiler announced the starter. A few things I'm looking at when I see something like this. I'm going to go back to 2015 when Osweiler was with the Broncos, when he played alongside Demaryius Thomas and Emmanuel Sanders. I'm looking at all games, all 3 played, and over that span, Demaryius Thomas had a 28% target market share, Sanders 22%, though Sanders had the much higher ADOT, 16.4, to Demaryius Thomas's 10.1. So he was more the deep ball guy, where Thomas was the ball hog, seeing the majority of the volume. But most importantly, and not something we've seen with Simeon at the helm, is that under Brock Osweiler, Demaryius Thomas destroyed him in terms of near end zone usage. Thomas saw 6 of Osweiler's 12 targets inside the 10. Sanders saw only 1. Thomas saw 7 of Osweiler's 13 end zone targets to Sanders' only 1. I think this is interesting because the Eagles are allowing the second most fantasy points per game to outside wide receivers. Thomas is still very, very cheap. He runs 52% of his routes from the left. Philadelphia is allowing the second most fantasy points per game to opposing left wide receivers. He's going to run against Rasul Douglas, our 80th highest graded cornerback, while Sanders mostly gets Patrick Robinson, our 3rd highest graded cornerback. Osweiler also targets tight ends super heavily. Since 2015, 26.3% of his attempts. That's the 5th highest rate in the league over that stretch, while the league average is about 7 points below that at 19.3. A.J. Derby potentially in play against Philadelphia, who's allowing the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends. Maybe. No, probably you're just playing Philadelphia's defense against Osweiler because he is most likely terrible. Did want to bring up those metrics because I haven't heard them echoed anywhere else. I know some people are playing Carson Wentz this week. Denver isn't at home. Wentz is looking unbeatable, like a top 3 quarterback. So I get the contrarian sentiments there. Tyler, what do you make of this pathetic 4-minute monologue on potentially the worst quarterback in the league?
Yeah, I'll be fading Brock Lobster. No desire to play him at all. Demaryius Thomas, it's kind of hard to take any of the statistics he's had over the last couple of weeks with Trevor Siemian as gospel. He's had 75 yards combined over the last 2 games on 15 targets. That's just dreadful considering how inept this offense has looked. I think they do need to make a change. I just don't think Brock Osweiler is the answer here. I think loading up on Eagles defense is a shrewd move where they should see a lot of pressures and turnovers.
Right. So let's move on to our next topic here. And that is, what do we do with this Houston-Indianapolis game? Everyone wants to target it. Watson's going to be super chalky. Him and Fuller both are due for some massive touchdown regressions, but it's hard to see that coming this week in what's easily the dream matchup for any quarterback, any passing attack. The Colts secondary is likely to be without their only positively graded cornerback, Rashaan Melvin, their only positively graded safety, Malik Hooker. Melvin still is in concussion protocol. Hooker after the rest of the season. Indianapolis is allowing the most fantasy points to quarterbacks over expectation, meaning looking at all the quarterbacks they've faced to date, they're scoring a lot of points over what's expected based on their average. Watson ranks second in terms of fantasy points on deep targets. Indianapolis is allowing the most deep fantasy points per game. The third most fantasy points to outside wide receivers, where Will Fuller, DeAndre Hopkins lines up. Hopkins runs 54% of his routes from the left, third most among all wide receivers, while Indianapolis is allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing left wide receivers because Vontae Davis is terrible now. What are you doing with Watson? What are you doing with those wide receivers? They are very expensive now, but it is a dream matchup.
Yeah, like you said, that Vontae Davis matchup is something that we should pursue. He's currently our number 98 graded cornerback out of 114. The question is...
Yeah, but Indianapolis is allowing the most deep fantasy points per game to opposing receivers. Like, that's Will Fuller, right? So he's 100%. In a good matchup, too.
They both are. They're just priced so high, it's just hard to justify.
You know who's not priced too high? The tight ends.
Lamar Miller?
Ryan Griffin. But yeah, no, that's where I was ultimately going. I think, I love Lamar Miller as a leverage play. So he averaged 12.3 expected fantasy points per game heading into last week, but totaled 21.5 on Sunday, saw a season high 87% of the team snaps. Donta Foreman seeing a season low 1 snap. This could certainly be a 1-week outlier, but I'm optimistic for Miller this week, considering Indianapolis is allowing the third most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, fourth most on the ground. Again, shouldn't be too highly owned. Added benefit of being a leverage play in tournaments off of Watson, but I don't know. Watson might still be worth paying up for in cash.
Yeah, I think you need to get some creative exposure here.
Yeah.
Like Lamar Miller, yeah, this game is the highest implied score of the week for the Texans. Houston is a 13-point home favorite. This is like the ideal matchup we want our running backs to be in. Massive home favorites with a high team total. The Colts are allowing the most rushing touchdowns as well to opposing running backs, and Miller has seen at least 15 touches in every game so far this year. We don't really have to worry about Donta Foreman. I think this is Miller's game to crush. But like you said, I think we need exposure to everyone here. The problem is Hopkins, at least on DraftKings, is priced $1,400 higher than the next wide receiver, $9,300 compared to Julio's $7,800. That's a huge price jump, and I'm curious to see how much ownership chases that after seeing him just go off on an 8-catch, 224-yard, 1-touchdown performance last week. It seems like everybody was talking about that Houston-Seattle game, and I think it's going to draw a ton of ownership here. I think, like you mentioned with the tight ends, I think that's a great way to gain some cheap exposure to it. Ryan Griffin's in a great spot here. Jack Doyle on the other side's in a great spot here. I think getting some exposure to both them is a great way to find some way to get access to this game.
Yeah, so I think you're right. I think I'm going to be lower owned than the field on the wide receivers, on Watson probably. Higher owned on Lamar Miller. Brissett's honestly somewhat intriguing with everyone going to be so into Houston, and he's much, much cheaper. But on the Indianapolis side of the field, I'm hearing T.Y. Hilton is chalk, and it's not for the reasons why he should be chalk either. Basically, the Houston Texans run a quarters defensive scheme at one of the highest rates, and how you attack that deep, big post routes over the safeties' heads, things like that. That's where T.Y. Hilton has earned his living over the past few years on the deep ball. He also runs 38% of his routes from the slot, should face off against Kareem Jackson, who ranks bottom 6 of 72 qualifying cornerbacks in fantasy points per route and fantasy points per target. And Houston, we just talked about Indianapolis allowing the most. Houston's allowing the second most deep fantasy points per game. Like I said, that's how you attack Houston. And the head coach just came out and said, we got to find ways to get T.Y. Hilton the ball. Of course, he said that last week when Jack Doyle exploded for 30.1 fantasy points. Luckily, we were on Jack Doyle last week, but he has a fairly soft matchup as well, and he's leading the team in expected fantasy points, well above T.Y. Hilton since Jacoby Brissett took over. He's fourth now among tight ends in expected fantasy points per game, still far, far, far too cheap based on his salary on both sites. And Houston's allowing the seventh most fantasy points per game to opposing tight ends, so the matchup is good as well. This is the game everyone's going to be on. I think for tournaments, Tyler, we should, and this is me queuing you up for a monster segue right now, is I think we should instead try to attack a different game that less people are going to be on. And that game is?
It's going to be the Dallas-Kansas City game, right?
I think I'm with you, man. Let me
Did
hear
I
your
nail it?
arguments.
Okay.
Let me hear your arguments.
I'm pretty into this Dallas-Kansas City matchup here. Both quarterbacks are in great matchups here. The opposing secondaries are liabilities. We've seen Terrence Mitchell allow the most receiving yards among all cornerbacks. He was subsequently benched last week for Philip Gaines. Gaines went on to also disappoint, and I think they're moving on to the third guy now, just trying to find anybody that can play opposite Marcus Peters. The Dallas Cowboys are also allowing a pretty significant amount of fantasy points allowed. I just think both passing attacks have a chance to absolutely flourish here, and I think we need to find some ways to get creative here stacking it. I'm talking like Bryce Butler, a little Tyreek, some Travis Kelce, like bouncing around with a little bit of the primary and secondary plays. I think that instead of attacking this heavily owned Houston Indy game, finding another game to game stack could be a bit of a contrarian move just in and of itself.
I'm with you. Also, an interesting thing to note is Prescott leads all quarterbacks in fantasy points per dropback over the past 2 seasons. If he dropped back the same amount as Tom Brady, he'd have 44 more fantasy points, or 2.2 fantasy points per game more than, yes, Tom Brady. So what does that mean? That means if we can project him to drop back at a higher rate this week, it unlocks massive potential. So why would we think that would be the case? Well, no Ezekiel Elliott, highest over-under of the week. It's a pick'em. Vegas is projecting a close scoring shootout. Let's go, man. Kansas City's defense allowing the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. 2 of the 11 highest quarterback games of the year came against Kansas City, while Dak owns the 12th and 13th highest scoring games of the season. I'm with you on Prescott at home versus Kansas City. I'm also on Drew Brees at home against Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay's defense ranks 3rd worst in schedule-adjusted fantasy points per game allowed to opposing quarterbacks, and I'd imagine they'd still rank 1st if it wasn't for the 20-mile-per-hour winds Cam Newton was throwing into last week. There's still a huge pass-funnel defense, ranking 11th best in opposing yards per carry, but 5th worst in opposing passer rating. And sometimes I just try to look at my redraft rosters as a DFS lineup to make better decisions. But sometimes I also try and look at my DFS lineups as if they were a redraft roster. And so I'm taking a season-long approach here. It's Drew Brees, man. From 2014 to 2016, he finished top 6 in 38% of his games. That was behind only Rodgers, Luck, and Brady. He's finished top 6 just 0 times this season. I'm betting that changes. And when we get to the running back position, I'll further argue the cause for Drew Brees.
I like that, man. What's interesting is that the Buccaneers have allowed 3 top 6 quarterback performances so far this year, 4 top 12 performances. So I think this is a bounce back game here for Brees playing at home. He's hit the 300-yard mark just twice. That's so uncharacteristic of Brees. I'm expecting a big bounce back here, and I'm ready to stack him up with Michael Thomas and go after that big game that we have yet to see from the two of them this year.
Oh, it's coming this week.
It's coming, and I want to be on that gravy train when it leaves the station.
Give me some other quarterbacks around this week. I think cash is kind of hard. There are a few, at least for me, cheap quarterbacks to like on the main slate. Any other big name tournament plays from you?
Just Alex Smith is somebody I want to get some action on. We did talk about that Dallas KC game. Just want to make sure I emphasize him a little bit more. I think he's in a great spot here. But the guy that I want to pay down for was someone we kind of touched on, was Jacoby Brissett at 5,200. I think he's in play for cash. This Houston defense can be exploited. I mean, just look at what Russell Wilson did last week. Brissett only needs to hit 15.6 points to reach cash value, that 3x value we try to get. Houston has allowed that in 4 of 7 games to start the year, but they're also no stranger to complete meltdowns. Alex Smith put up 29.9 DraftKings points against them. Russell Wilson put up 39.1. Tom Brady, 39.7. Like, there's a massive ceiling to chase here, and I'm willing to go with it with Brissett. The Texans have a ton of injuries so far on defense this year, and we can add Jadeveon Clowney and Jonathan Joseph as 2 guys that could be questionable for this week. They were both DNPs on Wednesday, and I just like the matchup for Brissett where they could be down massively. He'll have a lot of garbage time to throw to. And he also has some significant rushing upside as well. He's rushed for 30 yards and or a touchdown in 4 of his last 6 games. I think that provides a nice boost to his floor. And on a week where there's not much value to be had, paying down at quarterback could make sense.
Right. I'm definitely with you. Actually, on both calls, teams are passing on Dallas, the 3rd highest rate in the league. That bodes well for Alex Smith, but definitely agree with the Brissett call. Also, we got to talk about Russell Wilson. He's now getting a new left tackle. Darrell Bevell's hitting career highs in plays per game and passing plays per game on offense after hitting new career highs the season before. And volume was always the concern for Russ, and now it's not looking like that anymore. Or is it? Pete Carroll, though a notorious liar, has been talking up Eddie Lacy, saying we're going to see a lot of Eddie Lacy this week. I'm not sure, but definitely worth mentioning Russ Wilson, who looks fantastic. We also talked about Carson Wentz a little bit as a contrarian play against Denver. Probably not too on that. Any other shaky names before we move on to running backs?
No, I like the Russ call too, especially because the Redskins, when they do allow red zone trips, their opponents are scoring on nearly 60% of them. That's a top 6 in the league. I think Russ is a good play here, especially with that added protection here.
Running backs. All right, so I'm excited about this. I'm typically the stats guy, but I've come up with a little bit of narrative street.
Okay, mixing it up a little. What do you have?
Alvin Kamara, RB10 on DraftKings, RB14 on FanDuel in terms of pricing. So, Mark Ingram fumbled twice last week after fumbling 2 weeks previous. After his second fumble last week, Kamara got the final 3 running back touches in the game. In weeks 7 and 8 of last season, he had fumbles in 2 consecutive games. And then what happened? He got benched for Tim Hightower, who is terrible and not in the league anymore. From that week until the end of the season, Mark Ingram only saw 5 carries more than Hightower, despite outgaining him by 248, a 6.0 yards per carry average to 4.0. We've seen coaches, specifically this one, do stupid things before to punish a guy. I'm going to load up on Kamara and bump up Brees ever so slightly just because of it. But the matchup is also better for Kamara than Ingram. Tampa Bay is a pass funnel defense, ranking 11th best in opposing yards per carry, 5th worst in opposing passer rating. We just said that. Breeze should be throwing more anyway, and Kamara is kind of used like a wide receiver anyway, lining up as a wide receiver on 42% of his routes, which is the highest rate among running backs. What do you think about that?
He was the first running back I wrote up because I used him last week in cash, and he scored that early touchdown. Was pretty happy with that outing. But I deleted it and put in Mark Ingram instead. There's a $1,300 price difference between the two, and I'm okay paying up that extra money for Ingram this week. We're seeing the Buccaneers defense. They're not what they should be. They've been facing a lot of injuries, and they're just really poor on run defense. They rank top 10 in most fantasy points and touchdowns allowed to opposing running backs. The Saints are 7-point home favorites. As much as I want Breeze to go off, and I want Breeze to go off, I think we could also see Mark Ingram get enough volume. He's averaging 26.7 touches per game since the Adrian Peterson departure, and he's averaging 26 fantasy points per game over those last 3 outings as well. I think he's the safer bet to hit volume and fantasy point expected outcome compared to Kamara. We're paying up a lot for Kamara now. That's the problem. His price has gotten to the point where he's no longer a value. He's no longer easy to hit 3x value. It's getting to his ceiling. What do you think about that, paying up for Kamara?
You're absolutely right. He is expensive relative to current usage, but I'm expecting an increase this week based on my little narrative. But that's fine. You can fade my narrative.
First sentence I wrote was about the 2 fumbles, and then I deleted it. And I'm like, no, Tyler, this is a stats-based pod. We're sticking to the numbers.
Kareem Hunt, I think we'll finally get him at low ownership. People are panicking due to a lack of touchdowns. Those will come. He is Exodia. I am going to have heavy exposure. He's my number 1 running back in my rankings. There's not much to say. He's the GOAT of all time. And Todd Gurley, another guy like this. Not too many stats here, but it's just Gurley plus Rams D stack all day. They're going to obliterate the Giants. The Giants have no running game, and that's how you beat this Rams defense. The sellout to stop the pass at the expense of the run. The Giants don't have a running game. They also don't have a passing game. Though Sterling Shepard is due back. Gurley leads all running backs in fantasy points per game. Even in a 33-0 rout last week, Gurley still saw 8 targets. Pay up for him. He's great. Lock and load. Let's go.
Yep, I couldn't agree anymore. He had 22 carries and 8 targets, like you said. I'm going to steal one of your stats, actually. Gurley leads all players on the main slate in both actual opportunity per game at 19.4 and PPR points per game at 23.9. This Giants defense could get burned. Zeke went for 29 combined touches for 140 yards and 22 DraftKings points. Melvin Gordon had 26 total touches for 163 yards, 2 receiving TDs, and 37.3 points. I think this is a big ceiling game we could see from Gurley here in this matchup.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Another guy, there's a few actually. I think Joe Mixon's probably still in play against a Jacksonville run funnel defense. They rank dead last in opposing yards per carry, but best in the league in opposing passer rating. Mixon saw 11 of 17 carries and all 3 running back targets last week. Performed well outside of that frustrating fumble. Doug Martin, kind of on him. He's probably appropriately priced based on volume, but the matchup's nice. He ranks 17th among running backs in expected fantasy points per game, but those were 4 straight losses, 3 straight games against teams who ranked top 10 in yards per carry allowed. Volume and production should improve against a Saints defense that ranks 7th worst in yards per carry allowed. Don't see a lot of people being too on him.
Yeah, I'm not one of them. 7-point road dogs, I'm fading, considering he doesn't get a ton of receiving work. He has been seeing some significant carries on the ground. That's been a very big positive for him. But I'm going to look for the home matchups where he's in a better spot to use him. I think it's interesting, though, in tournaments, considering how high this game total is between the Bucs and Saints. It's only behind the Dallas-Kansas City one. Another stud I would be remiss if we didn't mention was Leonard Fournette. He's priced up there, but he's coming off a 3-week resting period, coming off their bye. He hurt his ankle, and now he's got plenty of time for him to get better. I really like this matchup here against Cincinnati. Opponents are running on them 45.7% of the time. That's the 6th highest rate in the league. Jacksonville leads the league in rush play percentage at 53.12%. I think this is going to be a volume-heavy game for the fresh legs of Fournette, and I think he makes for a very strong cash game play to anchor lineups around.
I will not be playing Fournette in cash. I will continue to hate on him in this matchup as well, as the team ranks 10th best in yards per carry allowed. Fournette averaging 4.58 yards per carry, but 3.37 without those 2 carries of 50 or more yards. Easily the biggest disparity among all running backs to have at least 2 carries of 50 or more yards over the past decade. I'm just a Leonard Fournette hater though, so when he gets another 89-yard touchdown run, please be sure to @ me. Those are massive for tournaments, don't get me wrong, but I just find them to be unpredictable, unstable. Don't see that happening.
So I'm
again.
going to disagree with you there. I don't think he has tournament appeal because of his limited reception upside, but I think he hits that 20 carry mark in almost every game. That's why I'm interested in him.
But he doesn't.
I think
catch...
he's a safe play.
See, I don't think he's a cash play because of that lack of a receiving workload.
It's hard to argue against it. I see your point there, yeah.
See, but now I'm going to argue for a guy who's very similar and probably has more warts. That's Adrian Peterson. Arizona's favored by 2.5 points. They're starting a backup quarterback. They're playing on the road. Peterson has played on 65% of Arizona's snaps and has averaged just 13.5 expected fantasy points per game over the past 2 weeks. It's not a lot. But Arians has promised more work for Peterson as a patch catcher, although I'm skeptical. Still, he's in easily the best matchup of the week for any player. San Francisco's allowing the 34.0 carries per game this season. That's the most. Teams are passing on San Francisco at the lowest rate in the league. Arizona is passing on the highest rate in the league, but they're without their starting quarterback. Probably go more run heavy this week. And the matchup, like I said, is it's over the past 2 seasons, San Francisco's not only allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs, but more than Ezekiel Elliott has averaged. They're like to RB1s, they're a top 5. Whoever's facing them is a top 5 RB on average. So I'm all over Adrian Peterson despite the advanced age and the other things I mentioned.
On the other side of the ball, I kind of think Carlos Hyde's interesting as well. It really, I'll be frank, it honestly depends if Jimmy Garoppolo plays, which I'm not 100% sure yet. This midweek trade has made a lot of things shaky going around the league. But if Garoppolo plays, I think it raises the ceiling of everybody in this offense, but I think it raises the floor and ceiling of Carlos Hyde the most. I think he could be in line for a significant amount of volume where they could maybe have positive game script for once and take advantage of it that way. Again, these are risky plays, but I think they're in play. I don't think there's anything wrong with that if you need to save some money.
Right. I think even if Garoppolo doesn't play, and I don't think he does, Hyde's just still kind of in play. He's gross, but his volume is much better than his price tag. I think on both sites, but especially DraftKings. And just based on that usage near the end zone, based on the volume he's seeing as a receiver, although he's inefficient with it, is just really attractive. I'm going to have exposure to him. There's a lot of really cheap names to like. We could just mention them and move on, or if there's any of these guys you want to talk about briefly. And that's Kenyon Drake, DeVante Booker, Alex Collins, Matt Forte, Marlon Mack, maybe Javorius Allen. Anyone stand out to you?
Not really. This is gonna be a week I'm gonna pay up at running back. But if you have anyone you want to highlight here, go ahead.
Marlon Mack's only really valuable in games where we can project negative game script, but they're 13-point underdogs. Cecil Lammey, the Denver beat writer, said that the team is going to make a concerted effort to get more usage out of Booker, and they prefer him as a receiver. Philadelphia is allowing the fourth most receiving fantasy points per game. Alex Collins continues to be hyper efficient. 18 carries, 113 yards last week. Seeing more volume. Those 18 carries, I believe, were a season high. Also, 2 targets and 2 receptions. He had 0 receptions coming into the week. He's very cheap. Kenyon Drake, Adam Gase called him the number 2 back earlier this month, so that should imply he's going to be the RB1 now that the RB1 left. But this is still likely an running back by committee approach. He did see all 6 of the non-Ajayi carries last week. He's minimum priced on FanDuel. These are guys I'm going to have some exposure to, but certainly not a lot.
I like it. Let's move on to the wide receiver position.
You're the boss.
Okay. All right. Top wide receiver. It's got to be Nuke. I mean, he's priced so much higher than everybody, but he's coming off a fantastic performance. We've already nailed this conversation here, so I'm just going to highlight it real quick. Vontae Davis is terrible. Nuke runs the majority of his routes against him. He should see a ton of matchup. He's coming off a massive performance. He has a ridiculous target market share. Fire up Nuke, and you're gonna win some money. Next up, Julio Jones. Inconsistency has led to a massive price drop for Julio. This is the first time he's been priced under 8K on DraftKings since week 16 of 2014. He has just one 100-yard performance and 1 touchdown throughout his first 7 games. This is the most un-Julio stat line you could ever imagine. And players this good, they don't stay bubble wrap for so long. I'm expecting him to have a massive breakout game. I'm not sure if this is it. However, in his last 4 games against Carolina, he's put up stat lines of 4 catches, 60 yards, 0 touchdowns. Then he put up that 12, 300, and 1 stat line. 2015, he put up a 9, 178 and 1, 7, 88 and 0. There's a ceiling here that's worth chasing in GBPs. And considering his price tag compared to someone like DeAndre Hopkins, I think I'd rather have nearly twice the amount of exposure for Julio than I would for Nuke. What do you think about Julio this week? It's tough with Carolina. They have some really good cornerbacks. James Bradbury's playing out of his mind, so it's not an ideal matchup from that perspective. But I just think the ceiling for Julio is one where I don't want to miss it.
Right. I think a lot of people are going to chase that 300-yard game he had against them last year. This is the second longest streak of Julio Jones' career where he did not hit 100 receiving yards in any of his last 5 games. I've decided that Julio Jones is just unpredictable over the past in when he goes off. Over the past 2 seasons, he ranks